Okay, so very pleased to meet you, Helen.
You too.
I thought you might want to start with talking about where you grew up in Mumbles
Mm-hmm.
and how long you lived there.
Yeah.
Perhaps relating it to the fact that you see yourself maybe as an out-alonger.
Yes, and I'll explain why. When I give you a little bit of my history, if you like, I'll explain why I'd be seen that way. So, do you want me to
Yes,
introduce
please.
myself
Yes,
first?
please.
My name's Helen Lewis, and I was born a long time ago. My dad was brought up in Southend. He was born on one of the big houses right on the front, a few doors down from the Pilot, and there used to be a fire station there, so that's where he was born. And then later his family moved up to what they called the Bank, George Bank, Clifton Terrace, up behind it. So that's where I spent an awful lot of time growing up, obviously, and that's how I would qualify as an out-alonger.
So you grew up close to Mumbles Hill?
Yes, I did, yeah. When I was born, initially, my mum and dad had a little wooden bungalow up Western Lane. The continuation of Western Lane takes you up Thistlebourne Hill.
Yes.
So you've got Village Lane and Western Lane, and they converge,
Yes.
and they take you up to the corner, really, with Higher Lane.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was a few years old, then they bought a bungalow on Thistlebourne Drive, which is further up, very, very close to the Mumbles Hill.
I know, yeah.
Sorry, go on, Helen.
No, I was going to ask, so the wooden bungalow then, they sold that, or they just moved?
When in Western Lane, they were renting that.
Right.
Yes, that was
Okay.
a little wooden chalet style bungalow that was that we lived in when I was small. And my mother always said she loved it. She loved the style and the layout of the wooden bungalow, and she would.
Can you remember anything about that area?
Oh yeah. But I mean, because of only moving up the hill then, essentially, we used to pass where we used to live every day, going to the village for shopping or going back and forth to school. And my mother always used to point out the one that we used to live in, and we walked up there a couple of times so she could show us. Yeah, and it was a pretty unique place to live. It was lovely.
How many other bungalows were there?
There was probably about a dozen.
Quite a few.
I may be overestimating that, but there were a few along there, and they had fantastic views, as you can imagine. But they were all wooden construction, and most of them had these lovely sort of old style verandas or porches. They were quite fascinating little places. They were.
Do you know how old they were? Were they from the war?
They probably would have been from around, or possibly around the 30s, 1930s. Yeah, because round backside then lime slate, that was an almost completely, it was almost completely made up of wooden bungalows when I was growing up, of a very similar style, and they'd been there from about the 1920s, 1930s. There was still a lot there when I was a kid, because as you can imagine, lime slate was my stomping ground, as was the Mumbles Hill. We used to play on the hill all the time.
Yeah, I bet it's coming to that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
What playground?
It was very different when I was growing up, because none of the paths were made up like they are now. And we knew where all the landmarks were, the sort of historical landmarks. We knew where they were. We used to call them the underwalls, and there was another little brick building that we found, which it's more or less been completely buried in undergrowth now. And I can still remember roughly what the spot was, but we used to play in there. But of course they were all relics from the Second World War, Yeah, that's right.
So you can't, so that building you remember, you can't, it's not visible now.
One of them is. One of them is the one we call the underwalls is.
Yeah, is that where you go under
Yeah,
and down?
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know why we called it the underwalls.
Yeah, I
but,
like
but
that. Local dialect.
yeah. And then a bit further over onto the hill, there was another brick building that you had to make your way downwards, so you had to go down some steps underneath. It's at one time there would have been windows there, but it was almost surrounded by undergrowth then, and since it's just sort of become completely covered. Yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah. So used to love playing up on the hill.
Was there a lot more foliage there? Scrub, and was it clearer?
There were no made up paths,
right.
So all the paths were really, really rough. So there was a lot more scrub there. The paths were ones that were sort of made by footfall, really. So there were like little areas that were easy to walk on. Okay. But now they've widened them, they've made them much more definite paths and covered them with gravel. They put fencing in. Because we used to have a spot that we called the Ski Mountain, which was basically a spot above, you know where the sewage vents are now, as you're heading towards Limesley.
Yeah, the cutting.
Yeah, just before you get to the cutting. And it's essentially a slope with very, very loose stones and shales on it. And we used to skid on there from the top to the bottom, highly dangerous. And you notice that it's been fenced off now for people to see.
In the old coal heaps, and where I grew up.
Yeah.
Highly dangerous.
Very, very, very dangerous. But
so did you go to the beach, or did you play around there mostly?
Mostly played around there, but we did used to go down on the front. Because of where my grandparents lived. So the way that my dad would take us down to my grandparents is down the hill, over Mumbles Hill. We didn't used to use the road. So there was a path that ran from the top of Mumbles Hill.
Yeah. And
it would take you down, and it would come out by Dick Slade, which runs alongside the George. And then we just go up on the bank.
So no steps there then?
No. The Dick Slade's steps were there, obviously, but not beyond that.
Okay.
That was like a rough path again. Yes, we'd make our way down there with Dad and go to visit our grandparents.
So Southend.
In Southend, yeah.
The park was there?
Yeah, Southend Park was there then, yeah.
Okay.
And the Crazy Golf was there when I was growing up, yeah.
So you grew up there until about when?
15.
When did you leave, say, the family home?
Oh, well, we left there, we left Thistlebourne when I was 15.
Right.
And then we moved to Norton then, Butehaven Terrace in Norton.
Okay.
I left the family home when I was 18 to go and do my nurse's training.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
But you've moved back to Mumbles?
Yeah. So when I came back after doing my nurse's training, I lived in a number of different places. But I lived in a few chalets. So I went to Landcliffe Park, and I went to Bridal Mews, and then I went back to Landcliffe Park. So I was hanging around that area for a while.
I wonder why.
Yeah, I absolutely love it.
Yeah.
And I got to say that Limeslade is my favourite beach. I used to love going down on the front when I was a kid. We used to spend a lot of time down there with my mum and my dad and my grandparents. But Limeslade, I used to love going down there in the winter, and when the sea was really, really rough and grey and thrashing against the rocks, and I used to like sitting perched up in the rocks just watching the sea. And very often you'd see a few seals round and about, because they wouldn't come too close when the beaches were busy, but when the beaches were deserted and it was a bit more bleak, then you'd be able to. Well, they were probably feeling more bold then, weren't they?
Yeah.
There were less people around.
They're quite bold now. Apparently. Particularly bold.
Yes.
So you had lots of happy memories in that area, and obviously it's brought you back. And then you're still in touch with other people that have lived in the area and friends.
Yeah.
Do you remember families that lived around you that still have links?
Yeah. Well, we used to. Back in those days, with my grandparents, particularly my grandmother, her family had lived there for generations.
Wow. So what was her surname?
Owen, yeah, Gwyneth Owen her name was. Yeah, and her dad, David Owen, he was a fisherman. That's how he made his living.
Right. So he fished at
Yes, in Oystermouth Bay.
Bay.
Yeah, that's where he fished. And then in the summertime, to sort of boost his income, he would take holiday makers around the bay in his rowing boat.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So that community was so linked to the sea, wasn't
Absolutely.
it? So you notice a difference now?
Yeah, very much so. That's how they made their living. And my grandmother, she used to tell me about how her and her brothers and sisters in the summertime, when their dad was taking the boat out with taking day trippers out around the bay, and the kids would swim out following the boat, and their dad, to get them away from the boat, he'd hit them with the oars. Can you imagine that?
I think it sounds brilliant.
Imagine whacking your own kid with an oar to get them away from the boat. But that's the sort of upbringing that they had, because I don't think, obviously, I don't think it was the most lavish of salaries or wages that you get from being a fisherman. Very hard life. Yeah. But she knew so many people in and around the area, so many families, like Graham Dirk's family. She knew them very, very well.
Okay. So you're all still friends?
Yeah.
And so both family roots go really far back then?
Yes, that's right. And we knew, when we would walk up Village Lane with my grandmother, if she was coming up to our house, and she could say hello to just about everybody in the homes there. She knew everybody, absolutely everybody.
Wow.
And then there were people that lived further up then towards Thistlebourne in the older houses there.
So where was Donkey Row exactly?
Donkey Row.
Yeah, where was that? Is that at the back of Village Lane?
Oh, is that where that is? Because there's Village Lane, and then you've got the Shop on the Hill, as we used to call it.
Okay, Shop on the Hill.
And then there is a row of houses. How can I explain them to you?
So where was the Shop on the Hill? Right at the top of the hill?
Well, where you've got Western Lane and Village Lane converging. And just on the left-hand side, you've got Titchbourne Street that comes down, and more or less opposite Titchbourne Street, you have the Shop on the Hill.
Like the pink house. That's not very helpful.
Yeah, there's it's called Hen Tea Cwrw now, which is old beer house. So I'm assuming that before it being a shop, at one stage it would have been a pub or a brewery. Because it's a very old building, and a lot of the houses up there are really, really old. You
can tell they're an unusual design and shape, and they're all mismatched.
They are. So they've cropped up at different times, haven't they? So obviously at that stage there wouldn't have been any particular town planning going on. You just plonked a house in a convenient spot, and some of them have evolved, haven't they? They've evolved from old farm buildings, for example. And at the top now, right at the top of Western Lane, or right at the top of Thistlebourne Hill now, rather, when I was growing up, there was what everybody termed as the old orphanage. And it was this large, austere, grey building, which was an orphanage. But it wasn't an orphanage by the time I came along, obviously.
Right.
There were some people in it had been converted into sort of really quite rough and ready flats,
Okay.
mostly unoccupied.
Oh.
And they were surrounding this sort of courtyard area, which obviously hadn't been maintained. And I remember going in there to play with a little girl once. I don't think her and her family lived there for very long, but we met playing, as you do, isn't it? And she took me there to meet her mum. But there were hardly any people living in there.
Yeah.
So it must have been quite lonely and echoey in the nights.
I bet.
Yeah.
And that was at the top, right?
Yeah. I think the new, I'm calling it new, but the housing development is Western Close, I think it's called now.
So it's right where that wall is, in a way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
And then behind the orphanage there was Wollacott's farm.
Yeah.
So there were farm buildings
Farm
there.
buildings.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting.
So it was really, really different. And you could walk through Wollacott's farm and you could come out on Bryn Terrace, and Bryn Terrace runs across the top of Tichborne Street.
Right. And you could walk straight across
Yeah.
the trackway.
Yeah, you could then, yeah. Yeah.
And that, so you call the lane, is that right? And your grandmother would have remembered everybody. Do you remember any of the family names on that street?
Yeah, well, I can remember the Dirks very well. And there were two, or three rather, two old sisters and an old brother that lived towards the top. I can't remember the name. I think it might have been Reese, but they all looked very, very similar. They were all, well, appeared to me at the time anyway, tall, but they were slim and they were very, very grey. And they still had gas lighting in their home. And this would have been in the 1970s. It was quite fascinating.
Yeah.
It seemed so old to us and very spooky.
Yeah.
But then a couple of times when we passed, one of them would be standing out on the doorstep and my grandmother would talk to them because she knew them. So that made me feel, a bit more comfortable then. Yeah.
So would you hear dialect at all?
Oh.
Mostly out longer is dialect.
They always spoke in that way.
Wow.
Because they'd say, oh, so-and-so, from up a long way, or they'd say from in a long way. And sometimes, considering how small the area of Mumbles was really at that time, they were quite disparaging about one another.
I can imagine.
And about people, not being from here, he's from up a long way. And you think, hang on. But yeah.
So those distinct
people were very tribal. Very, very tribal they were. I remember, oh God, this was when I was about 17 or 18, and I was in the White Rose. I was having a drink with my boyfriend, whose name was Andrew Long, whose family lived on Bryn Terrace, which is across Tichborne. And I was talking to, oh gosh, Nancy Kift. No, not Nancy Kift, their mother. Oh, I can't remember her name now, bless her, but she reminded me always of, the grandmother. I don't know whether you've ever seen the Giles cartoons, the grandmother in the Giles cartoons. She was very much like her to look at.
Brilliant.
And she was really quite stern and quite stout. And she took a sip of her beer and she said to me, boyfriend a mumble boy?
And how did you reply?
I said, yeah, he told her that he was. Oh, to who do we belong then?
Wow.
Yeah. So they all knew the family connections with one another, and it was all quite tribal, really, about what part you were from, what family you belonged to.
Did you prove?
It was hard to tell. She accepted my answer.
Wow.
She did accept my answer, but that's how people would. That's how
So
older
memories
people. Yeah.
would hold fast for a
Oh
long
my
time.
God,
I
they
would imagine.
would.
If you put a foot wrong,
Yes.
That
Yeah. Oh yeah. It ran deep. It ran
Yeah.
deep. You know, if you offended anybody, or everybody knew everybody else's family history going back to God knows when.
I bet.
It was quite difficult to know sometimes, talking to some of the older people, how long they were going back. How long they were going back.
I know.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, my grandmother lived there for a long time.
Yeah.
And then she lived in a row with her sisters up Queen's Road. I mean,
Oh,
I thought
yes.
nothing of visit at Christmas we'd
Yeah.
be taken.
Yes.
We'd start at the bottom and go to the top, and I didn't think it was unusual at all that
No.
so many of her sisters lived in a row.
No,
And
that's
some
right.
of them I liked, some of them
And
I
some of
didn't.
them worked,
Some of the
yeah.
houses I dreaded, and some of
Yeah.
them I looked forward to going to.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now I look back and think, gosh, that's quite unusual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, again, right to the top of Thistlebourne Hill, there were 3 ladies that lived next door to one another, and they were sisters, and they were all in different family strands in the Mumbles. There was the Llewellyn girls, Sarah and Angela, and they had an older sister, Debbie, as well. Yeah, that's right, Sarah, Angela and Debbie. So their grandmother was one, and I think one of them was related to the Passmores, who ended up in West Cross. Some of them did anyway. And I forget who the other one was now. But they had these really strong family strands, sort of. They were like the matriarchs of these 3 families.
Wow.
And some families had married into other families.
Yeah.
And there were all these sort of connections, like this big spider's web going on. And all the older people knew, they knew all of that stuff, didn't they?
Do you think they were bound by the jobs? So would most people living and working locally? Would you say?
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Yes, people would be working in shops, so they were bakers, or they owned little shops, or they were fishermen.
So what was this little the shop Kirks? Did you say?
Kirkhoff. Yeah, it was owned by a family called the Kirkhoffs when I used to go there.
Okay.
The
It's
shop
a small
on the hill.
shop, is it?
Yeah, it was a quite
Groceries.
small shop. Yeah. And it was still a type of shop where they'd slice your bread up for you, they'd slice your meat up for you, and everybody had a book, as they called it, a book. So they write down, they keep your book for you, and then you'd go in and pay off your book when you had money.
It was still a little bit like that when I started working Shepherds.
Yeah.
Everybody had a book.
Yeah.
Local families, and slice the ham.
That's it.
We even did petrol.
Yeah, I remember
Small
Shepherds
pumps.
doing petrol. I do. Yeah, I remember that. I remember
Collecting
stopping
scout
there.
stamps. Very slow paced
Yeah.
approach to everybody knew everyone. And so
Oh,
I
village.
noticed a change dramatically.
Yeah.
Would you say the change in Mumbles has been dramatic, or
It
did
has
you-
been huge. Because another little shop then, and it was known as Scott's when I was growing up, and that was, where the George is, and you get down onto the main road now. It's a
Yeah.
restaurant now.
Yeah.
What's the name of the restaurant?
So a few
Is it
little
Casa
ones.
Nostra? It's one of those. Anyway, that was Scott's shop.
Right.
And very much the same setup. It was run by John Scott, who was an hilarious man, and his wife, and everybody knew everybody that went in there, but very much the same setup. And they had the jars of sweets behind the counter, and they did just loads of things in there. everything.
Yeah.
Everything in there. But people would just go into the shop and they just be standing around gossiping, just talking.
Yeah.
And that's something that you don't see anymore, is it? You don't really see that. That people will just pass the time of day in somebody's business. You know, they're just all standing talking.
Yeah.
Like somebody would just be leaning on the counter
Chatting.
for hours, chatting,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was like that in our village shopping through crosses. Everyone would just be nattering away by the counter. Nobody would worry too much about it being their turn in the queue.
Oh no.
It was just
no, it
accepted
wouldn't.
as yeah.
It was like a
That's
meeting
a positive,
point, wasn't
isn't
it?
it?
Absolutely a
It's
positive.
a huge positive.
Because I don't think people experience the level of loneliness and isolation that they do now, because somebody was always looking out for you.
And if you lived on your own, you knew you could go out and have that conversation. Maybe even a cup of tea. Over the counter.
Definitely. There was a lady, a tiny little lady, she lived along by the Antelope, and everybody used to call her Little Kath because she was a tiny little lady, and she lived on her own, and I don't think she had ever married. I think she did actually eventually, really quite late in life, to her lodger, I think it was. But before that, I think her parents had lived in the home. When they passed away, it was just her, and she would, she'd make her way along the road. She'd come up as far as the bank where my grandparents lived, and she'd just be calling in, chatting with people, having a cuppa, like you said, isn't it, Kat? And nobody thought that was an unusual thing to do. It was very, expected of people that they would just call in, that they would just turn up at your home.
Do you think it's changed because there's been a change in, I suppose, the style of shops, and there's obviously a new development in Oystermouth, which probably affects further out along Southend. And then we have charity shops, that sort of thing. It's different, isn't it? You don't have the electrical store anymore. Well, there used to be two little shoe shops, didn't there? And then there'd be there are still independent shops, but maybe that's what it is. It's the change from independent shops to chain shops, or
I think that's definitely got something to do with it. I think it's the way that the developments have gone. And that we've seen a lot of the older family-run businesses have been nudged out, and like you said, not all of them, but certainly a lot. So the whole landscape has altered, but society's altered as well, isn't it? So we've had again people moving into the area from other areas that don't necessarily build that sort of sense of community that we had, where everybody knows everybody else. You've got the older generation, sadly, they've passed on, haven't they? Some of the families have sort of been priced out of living in Mumbles, really, so they've had to move out, maybe to West Cross, or maybe further out, even further out. So things have become more fractured in that way, isn't it? So that even though there's still a lot of people around that I know well, and we know that because we got our out along a group.
Of course.
Because I remember, obviously Paul Gavy's family really well. They were very well known to my grandparents. Amy Gavy, Paul's dad, Maureen, his sister, we all knew.
It's a shared language as well, isn't it? That
that's
dialect.
right. That's
so
right.
keeps that community together.
Yes, it does. When you think of it now, though, we are the older generation, more or less, now, aren't we? We're all knocking on now.
I know, it just makes you realise, I think, that dialect in active conversation still, which is considerably less active than it was, because as you've reflected,
Yeah.
Now, probably in a position where we're at a point where we need to actively preserve it.
Yes.
To remember, because the community that you know, it's a living thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
The community that was alive with it is fractured, as you said.
Yeah. Because everybody used to say, art. Everybody used to say things that they'd use the old terms, like I said earlier, they'd use the old terms for the areas, and they had their own little distinct ways of talking and their own, and the well, call them urban legends, but there'd be stories about people that stuck around for generations. There'd be the names, the labels that they had for things. And my grandmother used to use the word ronk.
Wow, what's that?
Yeah, well, she used to say that somebody, for example, was a ronk Tory, a ronk Conservative. Meant that they were very strong in their opinions and a bit immovable in their beliefs and that type of thing. I've never heard anybody use that word since.
No, but it's
Never.
quite onomatopoeic, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
Sounds
it is,
strong.
It does, yeah.
Do you know any other?
Definitely.
Can you remember any other words? There's the name. Any places? Any names of places you shared as children? One lady said she used to play on the concrete. Which is just the place that had been concreted over because she remembered the railway lines.
Oh,
you know,
right,
when she was
okay.
young.
Yeah.
So that was
So it'd been concreted over, and that's what it became forevermore.
Forevermore the concrete. And the hill, Mumbles Hill, is an abbreviation, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then so out along, how would you describe? Just while we sort of to finish our conversation, if you like, I think it would be nice if we say we're at the water fountain on Mumbles Road.
Yeah.
If we were to stand there and go out along, which direction would we go? Would we go
towards Southend?
Towards Southend.
Yeah.
And then up?
No, out along, because it refers to Southend. I don't know how far up the hill you would go if you up Western Lane. I don't know how far you would go up there. Because out along, I think, it sort of more or less refers to the front, so it refers to that Southend area, that spot. Yeah. I would never. My dad, for example, when we were living up in Thistlebourne, up on the hill, that's what they used to say. You live up on the hill.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have referred to that as out along.
Right. Just checking
To
that.
further down
really
towards the
in
seafront.
that place of Southend.
Yeah, that's what I would. That's what I would say.
So, what about in along?
In along, then you're going towards Oystermouth and Oystermouth Square, the squares they called it. So again, I'm not sure how much of a sort of circular area it would encompass, but again, it takes you along that area, the seafront, and probably some of the surrounding area up behind it.
Okay.
But I did used to I do remember people saying up along as well. So up along would probably again be, well, you're going along, but you're going up as well, isn't it?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course
You can see why they did it, can't you?
Yeah,
and round
makes
backside,
sense.
because you're going around and you're going on the back end of the village, really, aren't you?
Yeah.
So you can see where it came from.
You can. I think we'll put some arrows on a map.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the dialect has so many links across the sea and to that fishing community.
Definitely.
To go to Cornwall and see the house called Upalong recently, and see that connection so obviously was great, you know.
So it would have, because at one stage there would have been very little between Mumbles and Swansea, and now almost the whole area is built up, isn't it? Whereas going back a few generations, that would have been there would have been nothing really. So Mumbles was like a distinct little area. Well, Oystermouth as it was. Oystermouth was the village.
Right.
Mumbles, we referred to the Mumbles Head. It referred to those two islands.
I see.
That's where Mumbles came from. And now it's become like a sort of generic term for the area from Blackpill downwards, isn't it?
It has.
Whereas it never was. And some people will say Mumbles Bay. There is no such thing as Mumbles Bay. It's Oystermouth Bay and Swansea Bay.
Yeah.
But you can see how things are already evolving, can't you?
Absolutely. It's such a good thing to point out.
Yeah. And people saying they live in Mumbles when they don't live in Mumbles. You know, they live in West Cross, they live in Mayors, they live, you know. So people are starting to think of Mumbles as the entire area as a sort of suburb of Swansea now, isn't it? Whereas going back a few generations would have been this little fishing village, which it was a fishing village. It did rely on the sea for its living. Obviously, that's where most people worked. Oystermouth, obviously, there were a lot of oyster beds, cockle beds and things in the area. So that's how the village worked. It's how the village made its money for most people. There was very little between Mumbles and Swansea. It wasn't an affluent place by any means. It was poor. And I can remember even though things had started to change dramatically by the time I came along, there were still some very, very poor people living around, you know, the people who were known to be really quite down at heel and living in poor circumstances, which you don't really see in the area anymore because the property has become very expensive, it's become very sought after. We've got a lot of people who've come from other areas, and that has served to push the value.
Holiday homes too.
Holiday homes, yeah, which is a huge gripe of mine, massive, because now Village Lane, as an example, which was so full of life, which had all these wonderful families living in these tiny little cottages, and some of them were quite big families, quite large families in terms of numbers, living in these little cottages, beautiful little places, but you know, probably at the time really, again, quite run down. They wouldn't have had,
probably a bit damp.
Wouldn't have had indoor toilets. They would have had an outside, then possibly a shared one amongst several houses. But then when I was growing up, obviously things had been modernised to an extent from that, but people lived there. People lived in all those houses. Families lived, houses, they were homes. And now, I think just about all of them, there's the odd one or two that are still lived in the way they should be lived in, and the others are holiday homes and empty an awful lot of the time. And I think that's awful. And I think a lot of the development that's happened in the area has been to meet the needs of people from other areas. So they come to the area expecting a certain standard of restaurant, a certain availability of different things, isn't it? Not so keen on independent businesses. They like, they're more comforted by brands that they recognise, like Marks and Spencer, that type of thing. And I've heard people say, what Mumbles needs is a Waitrose. And I try not to get inverse snobbery to get in my way, and I try to take an even view of these things, but it does get on my nerves. It really does. It is gentrification. What's happened to the area is gentrification, isn't
At
it?
the expense of family.
At the expense of many people that have had to clear off, haven't they?
So Cornwall,
very, very.
we share a language, a dialect, and
yes,
and a housing crisis.
And the housing crisis. And that's what I was going to say about Mumbles, because when you read some of the older history, then there were people that came across from Devon in particular that settled in the area. And obviously the people that were here already, they merged with them, didn't they? And they sort of developed this culture that was that wasn't Den, and it wasn't Welsh. It was it was both. It was both, wasn't it? And they came together and formed their own sort of unique little their own little slice of it, didn't they? And it was pretty much untouched by influences from Swansea or from influences from other areas.
Really unique. It's even distinct. It's distinct from Gower dialect.
Yeah, very
they
much
share words.
There
is a very, really, as you've described, based in the place itself, the direction of activity, the location of families, shops and community hubs, if you like. Yeah, it's well, thank you, Helen.
Oh, that's all right. You're welcome. You're welcome.
So
nice to talk to you.
Yeah, does your daughter live in Mumbles now?
Yeah, she does. She lives in Chapel Street.
There we are.
She managed to buy. She's in
good.
It's carved up a bit, but it's an old Victorian house that she's in, and it's in 2 maisonettes.
Yeah.
So she was renting the top half, and Nigel, what was his surname? Nigel, the poet. Jenkins. It was his. And when he passed away, his daughters did it up a bit and rented it out. Okay. Naomi rented it for years, and then when the girls decided they wanted to put it up for sale, they gave her the first refusal. So she's got that, and in the bottom maisonette is Alan, Mr. Alan Passmore. Again, old family links to the area. And he was also my mother's partner for 25 years before she passed away. So
that's a really nice, positive.
It is. It is.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
I can cough now.
Oh my
so
God,
much. That's so interesting.
Oh, I hope so. My memory didn't serve me all that.